All right, kiddos, we're going to be talking about primary productivity today and trophic levels, both concepts that are wrapped up in this theme of ecosystems and of ecology. So let's just get right into it. But before we do, I want to give you a hot tip. Feel free to pause the video and take notes. I will be uploading these later to YouTube after Edpuzzle. That way you can kind of stop, go forward, fast forward, that we can study from them. But just really, I think I saw some folks that said they had watched the video yesterday but then had a hard time answering the questions. You really want to take a chance to process what you're hearing. And the best way to do that is by writing something down, like processing, writing, making a flashcard or something like that, taking notes. So just keep that in mind. All right. We're talking about living things. Ecosystems are filled with organisms. That's the whole point, right? And so here's the deal. Organisms need energy to live. We are big balls of complex, very organized matter, and we need a constant input of energy. And so I want to just talk about for a moment, like, what is energy? Where does it come from? And so energy, in the most basic definition, is the ability to do work. Okay, like, what does that mean? And, well, to do work, well, what does doing work mean? It's the act of displacing something being matter, using force. So just the act of displacing something through force. And so it's our ability to do work, our ability to do things, to move things around, to have things change. Things can't change without energy. And so energy is this thing that's like, it's not matter, it doesn't have mass, it doesn't take up space, but it's everywhere. It can be transferred into matter, it can be transferred out of matter, it changes matter. So energy is the ability to do work, and where it comes from, ultimately, all the energy in the entire universe is constant. And it started with the Big Bang. All the energy there was going to be, Big Bang, in that moment. There it is, all the energy. And so there's this law called the law of conservation of energy, which means we can't create nor destroy energy. Instead, energy just transfers between one form and another, in and out of types of matter, and on to the next. And that's why energy is such a hard thing to talk about, because there's so many lenses of energy. There's so many different kind of forms that energy can take as it's doing work on matter. There's heat energy, mechanical energy, kinetic energy, electrical energy, nuclear energy, chemical energy. It just goes on, ionizing energy. And then you start to think, well, maybe it's a bunch of different things, but really it's all the same thing. It's the ability to do work, and it's transferring from one form to another and through different types of matter and interacting with matter. An example of energy transferring from one form to another that's important for apes is your car. And so ultimately, we kind of know we have to feed our car, right? We have to put gasoline in the car. That's like a liquid. It's like a light brown liquid that goes into your car. And then somehow that liquid makes your car move at 80 miles per hour down a freeway. Well, that movement of those tires, that's mechanical energy, right? That's moving you down the road. So how did I go from having this liquid to having mechanical energy? I didn't force the gasoline into the car. It's not super pressurized or something. Well, that's because it's chemical energy. That's a type of energy. So chemicals, molecules, particles, they're held together. All of matter is held together through chemical bonds. Now, if you've already taken chemistry and biology, this totally makes sense. This is review. But if you haven't, you might have to take a couple steps back and maybe, watch some other videos as well. But all the matter is held together through chemical bonds, the molecules and compounds that make up our world. And inside these bonds is captured, stored energy. And when those bonds break and reform and we do chemical reactions, energy can be released. Energy in the bonds can be released when they're broken and reform into new types of matter. So when we break up matter held by chemical bonds and form new matter, energy can be released. We can actually have situations where energy gets absorbed, but we'll talk about that later. We can release energy, we can absorb energy through chemical bonds breaking and reforming. And so when we combust the gasoline, the particles of the gasoline, their particles break apart, the chemical bonds break up. You no longer have gasoline. Instead, you have things like CO2 comes out of your tailpipe. You didn't put CO2 in, but you get CO2 out. That's chemical reaction. You made a new chemical that wasn't there before. And many, many other chemicals come out the other tailpipe, as well as energy. So when you do that chemical reaction of combustion, it releases heat energy. So it goes from being stored chemical energy to being heat energy. And then that heat energy gets absorbed by the gas particles inside of your engine. And then they just got this heat energy, and they don't know what to do with it, so they start moving around faster. That's what particles do when they absorb heat energy. And they start moving so fast that it builds up pressure inside the piston of the engine, and that forces the piston, which is this metal structure, to get pushed down. And then all of a sudden, that heat energy got transferred into mechanical energy, which the piston's going up and down, then is mechanical energy that gets transferred into moving your car down the freeway. So thank you for bearing with me, but that's kind of an example of all the different transfers between types of energy, but ultimately they're all just doing work. It's all the same thing, but it's transferring from one type to another. Well, where does energy come from? Well, we know it comes from the Big Bang ultimately, but let's just talk about our home. How do we get energy here on our Earth? Well, it starts with this place. This is the sun, our solar system, right? Our sun is the supplier of energy for life on our planet. Now, how is the sun releasing energy? Well, there are atoms that make up the sun, hydrogen being the main component. And what happens is these hydrogen atoms, they collide with each other, and the protons and the neutrons in their nucleus, they collide and they attach to each other and they become helium. One of the most powerful energies that exists in our universe is nuclear energy, the energy associated with the nuclei of atoms. And when this fusion reaction occurs, it releases a tremendous amount of energy of different kinds. UV, obviously, light energy, a whole span of the electromagnetic spectrum seems to come out of the sun. So this nuclear reaction that has nuclear energy is happening on the sun, and it's bombarding our planet with tons of energy all day long. And so that's the ultimate source of where does the energy come from that sustains life on our planet. So our planet is not a closed system. We need the input of energy from the sun constantly for life on this planet. Now, what's really interesting is, if every living thing needs energy to stay alive, right? Life needs energy. It takes work to be alive. Now, these are all very actions, right? And running, obviously, that takes energy. Flying, eating this bug. The plants obviously need energy too, and those are really obvious examples of needing energy. But realistically, most of the energy that you're going to use up just happens through the chemical processes in your body. So my heart is beating, I'm digesting my food. Literally trillions and trillions of chemical reactions are happening inside my body, many, many more magnitudes than that at every moment. So what really keeps something living alive is all this chemistry happening in your body. And a lot of the chemistry that keeps you alive requires an input of energy. And so if every single living thing needs energy, how ironic is it then that there's only a subset of organisms that are even able to capture energy from the sun? So most of the energy that hits our planet from the sun, it doesn't get used. In fact, it just turns into heat energy, and that's it. And a small portion of it is capitalized upon by plants. So we can get hit by energy all day, and that energy does not get transferred into energy that we can use. We just don't have the ability to do that. But plants, that's what's special about. That's why plants are the best. Plants. Go green, you know what I'm saying? They are the only organisms on the planet that have the ability to take the energy being transferred to this planet from the sun, capture it, and store it in a version or a form that's actually usable by themselves, which are a living thing, and all other living things. And that's why plants are so cool. That's why we should underrate plants. That's why we should be nice to plants. We should try to help plants grow, find places for plants to grow. It begins and ends with plants. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Plants have the ability to do this specific chemical reaction that all the other living things can't do. Now, I hope you know what the name of this chemical reaction is. I do. So what is it? You got it in your head? It's super famous. You better have learned about it in middle school. Otherwise, you need to call up your middle school teacher and be like, what are you doing? You didn't teach me this? This is why there's life on our planet. Life. I see this and I go, life on the planet. It's also why plants are your best friend. Energy. Well, where does that energy come from? The sun. Now, there's a very small subset of organisms that can get this input of energy from chemical energy that's deep down in the ocean and hydrothermal vents. It's very interesting. Take biology. But let's just say everybody else, they're getting it from the sun. All right? And what they do is they take energy, and then they take water, which is a compound. It has 2 hydrogens and 1, there's no number here, which means 1 oxygen that are chemically bonded together through chemical bonds. That's a single water compound. 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, they're chemically bonded. So they take 6 water molecules, just 6 little water molecules, right? And they take 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 2 oxygens, 1 carbon. That's carbon dioxide. They take energy from the sun, and they take those 2 compounds, and they break the bonds up between those atoms and those compounds, and they reform. They create new bonds, and they form 2 new chemical substances that weren't there before. This is water, like you drink, and CO2, like you breathe out of your mouth or comes out of the tailpipe of your car. This molecule right here, it's called glucose. It's a type of sugar. And this is, of course, oxygen, which is gas at room temperature. And so you'll notice something. These are totally new substances. Oxygen gas isn't anything like CO2 gas. Nothing at all, except that they're both gases at room temperature. And glucose, sugar, is nothing like water. Not at all. So these are totally new chemical compounds that were not there before. But you'll notice something. They're made out of the same atoms. So just like energy is conserved, I can't create energy, I can't destroy it, it just transfers into different forms and through matter all the time. Chemists know that we can't create matter and we can't destroy matter either. And that's what's going on in this reaction. It's all the same atoms, but they're rearranged in a different combination. And that's what chemistry is. It's atoms rearranging themselves to make different compounds. That's what a chemical reaction is. You have reactants, and you have products. What I started with and what I end up with. If you really went through and you counted all up, there's the same number of each type of atom. So this 6, each water has 2 hydrogens, and I have 6 of them. So that's 12 hydrogens total to start with. And you'll come over here and you'll notice, oh, well, look at that. 12 hydrogens over here. I didn't make new hydrogens. I didn't get rid of the hydrogens. They're definitely bonded to something else. They're bonded to carbons now. They're not bonded to oxygen anymore. So this is the key molecule here, glucose. Glucose is stored chemical energy, like the gasoline. I can take this molecule and I can break it up. And when I do that, and I make different things, I release energy. So glucose is usable. I can release energy from this molecule. There's stored energy. So I took sunlight, radiation, a type of energy from the sun. I took radiation from the sun, and through photosynthesis, I transferred it from basically being radiation, like ultraviolet radiation. Specifically, when the energy we use here is light energy. The wavelength of energy that plants can actually absorb is of the light variety. So I take light energy and I transfer it into stored chemical energy. It's almost like potential energy. Chemical energy is like potential energy. It's the potential to go do work later if I do another chemical reaction. And these are just some images. So you can see like this bonding happening between the hydrogens and the oxygens and the CO2 molecules. And these are going to break up, recombine, and form these new molecules. And this is glucose. Look at how much more complex that molecule is. Lots of stored energy inside that molecule. So that is photosynthesis. This is the chemical reaction that makes life possible. I cannot use light energy to do anything. It just hits me and gives me a sunburn if it's ultraviolet radiation, and that's it. Maybe it gives me cancer. Yay! But plants can do this, and that makes glucose, and then glucose we can all use to do all the actual work that we need to do to survive. So photosynthesis, if you took biology, there's a lot to it. I don't need you to know the details, really. What I need you to know is that if you can do photosynthesis and you can create glucose, your plant, but specifically the word that we like to use is we call you a primary producer. or just a producer. You are a producer of energy. Now, they're not really producing it, right? They're just taking it from the sun and putting it into a new form. But you're producing in the sense that you're creating or changing it into a way that's usable for me. So be careful. It's not producing energy, it's just transferring it from being sunlight energy to being glucose. Or being stored in glucose. This is like a very simple diagram, but it's going to explain why most plants are green. So just so you know, back it up, since some of you haven't taken biology, plants have cells in them, and cells have organelles. And the organelle that's responsible for doing photosynthesis is called a chloroplast. And inside of a chloroplast, there's these stacks of what we call thylakoids. And inside those thylakoids are pigments, are chemicals that are able to absorb light energy and excite physical particles, which are called electrons, the particles that get excited. So there's these chemicals inside these little structures that can absorb light energy and do stuff with it to get this chemistry going. And the key is, when we look out, we see white light, which is the entire electromagnetic spectrum. But plants don't actually absorb all the light that comes in from the sun. They only absorb very specific wavelengths of light. And why plants are green has to do with what wavelengths of light they absorb. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. But if you're doing photosynthesis, you're a producer. Another fancy word for that is an autotroph. You can make your own energy. Yay. Again, they're not making it, they're just capturing it. But they can capture their own energy straight from the sun. So just to back up a little bit, because some of you haven't taken physics, this is your first science class of high school. Here's the deal. Energy, we have this thing called the electromagnetic spectrum. These are all types of energy, and they have different names based off of their wavelengths, or basically like how much energy they're carrying. So like if you think about energy like a wave, you can have waves that carry a lot of energy and waves that are like weaker, and you'll learn more about physics and how the wavelength thing works. But here's the deal. Lots of energy comes from the sun, and a very small subset of the energy out there in the world is what we call visible light. Light is the energy we can actually see. I can feel heat energy. It's coming off of me right now, but I can't see it, right? I can't see heat energy. I can't see potential energy. I can't see nuclear energy, but I can see light. Light is just a category of energy that we can actually see. The cells in our eyes are adapted to interpret, which is really cool, right? So you're literally seeing energy when you're seeing light, which is really fun. And we'll talk more about that when you take physics and chemistry and biology. But basically, there's this sliver of energy that you can actually see, and that's called light energy. And then of this entire spectrum of light energy, only certain wavelengths of light are going to be absorbed. Only certain portions of the energy are going to be used by plants. So lots of energy is coming from the sun. Only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that energy is being used by plants. And that fraction of light energy comes from the visible light spectrum, mostly. There's some organisms that do some other things, but we're going to use light energy if we're a plant. And so how does this work? Why do plants look green? Why does anything look any color, really, is what we're answering here, which is another complicated story. But these fancy words have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids. Those are some weird words. So remember that chemical I said was like inside of thylakoids, inside of plant cells that have organelles in them called chloroplasts? That little chemical inside of plants that can actually capture sunlight, is called chlorophyll. Okay? And there's two different types that most plants have. They're chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. So let's just look at chlorophyll A. You'll notice that chlorophyll A, it's going to absorb you got to really look closely here. So let me kind of look at the screen so I can see it really well. What's going on here? Yeah, okay. So what you'll notice here is that they absorb different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, but this is just the light portion. And basically, based on what they absorb, they look a certain way. And so you'll see this, I think the easiest one to notice is this one here that starts with a P. It looks mostly red. I think they did this, it correlated. But basically, if you're absorbing a wavelength of, between 500 and 600, that means you're capturing it, you're taking it in. So that's going to stay inside of you as a chemical. And the rest of the light gets reflected back out. And so, over here, I didn't absorb the 700 range, and I didn't absorb the 400 range. So what I actually see is kind of like a combination of red and blue. It looks kind of purpley. So when you look at a plant, sorry, I'm not making a ton of sense. If you look at a plant, it's green. Why is it green? Basically, the pigment, the chemical inside the plant, when it absorbs energy from the light coming from the sun, it's only absorbing certain portions of the spectrum. And it's mostly absorbing. There's one that's at like 680, which is kind of at the red colors. There's one that's down here that's near 400, it's the blue. Well, I'm absorbing mostly blue and I'm absorbing red. I took them in, they're gone. You can't see them anymore, they've been absorbed inside of me. What's going to be left is the green. So they look green because that's the part of the light spectrum that they can't absorb. That's like kind of energy left on the table. So when you look at something and it looks a certain color, that means that particular wavelength of energy was not absorbed by that object. And what you're actually looking at are all the energy wavelengths that it couldn't absorb that have been reflected back at you. So it's a common misconception. Kids think that plants absorb green light because they're green. But no, they don't absorb green. If they absorb green, we wouldn't be able to see the green. In fact, they're absorbing the red and the blue light, and the green's kind of being left out on the table. And so hopefully that explains like why plants look green. It's not super important for apes, but I just think for your life, you kind of know why plants look green. It has to do with the chemical that actually traps the energy, the light energy from the sun, and specifically what parts of that energy it's capturing. And so what about plants in the ocean? So people kind of think about terrestrial plants all the time, but there's this whole, set of living things in the ocean, and they need energy too, and only plants can capture it for them. So there are organisms in the ocean like phytoplankton and cyanobacteria. They're plants. They're organisms that plants, but they're just aquatic. And so they are doing all that photosynthesis, but they're in water. Now the funny thing about water is that it has this habit of, absorbing light energy itself. The water particle is absorbing energy. And so what happens is you can see these are different depths of the ocean. Certain wavelengths of light can make it to certain depths. Now you'll learn in physics that the wavelength of light that's blue is higher energy. Its wavelengths are shorter. If you go back to the slide, you'll see that it goes from blue to red, and you'll see that this says 400 and the red says 700. That has to do with the wavelength, and the shorter the wavelength, the more energy the wave has. So it's like in the same amount of time, 10 waves crashed on the beach versus one wave crashing on the beach. Like how many waves are passing in a certain amount of time is kind of a way to think about it. But essentially, blue light, what you do need to take away is blue light has more energy than, say, red light. And that's why it can penetrate further and deeper in the ocean. It's also why the ocean's basically blue. Like, why is the ocean blue? Water doesn't have a color. Light energy hits water, and it mostly gets absorbed. All these other, all these aspects of energy absorbed except for really blue. And so that's why water is blue. It's because it has to do with how it absorbs light energy and reflects light energy. And so, it takes a long, the blue light can really penetrate into the ocean before it gets absorbed. And so what that means is the organisms that do photosynthesis in the ocean, I told you that one of the wavelengths that terrestrial plants likes to use is red. And so the phytoplankton and the cyanobacteria in the ocean have adapted so that their photosynthesizing pigments or chemicals that trap the light are just a different variety, and they capture different wavelengths. And you might be thinking, light in general just doesn't get that far down in the water. And so they're all competing for light up here. And what's really interesting is they've done resource partitioning in these phytoplankton cyanobacteria. Scientists found that each different species kind of has like a different pigment, a different chemical in it that absorbs a different wavelength of light. So they're not, in fact, necessarily competing for the same wavelengths of light, which is really interesting too. So that's just some big picture ideas there, but just know that, they have special adaptations, plants that live in the ocean, and there are plants in the ocean, and they are, capturing energy for the rest of the living things. So basically, what about the plants in the ocean? Well, they've adapted. Most of the red light gets absorbed in that upper layer, as I said. Blue light's the only one that can make it, and it can only make it about 100 meters anyway. A lot of the organisms living down in the ocean are basically living in the dark, which is crazy. And how this affects them is they just have, different chemicals for capturing light, and they capture a different part of the visible light spectrum. And so that's really the takeaway there. Plants live in the ocean. Because they live in the ocean and water is filtering the energy for them before they can capture it, they have to have a different part of the spectrum that they're going to capture compared to terrestrial plants. And they're just so much more spread out. Phytoplankton are these tiny little organisms that you can't really see them like you can see a plant outside because they're way smaller. They're plants, but they're very small. They're not that many cells, so you can't see them as well, and they're dispersed, and that's why you don't see them floating around in the ocean. So now that we have an idea, like plants, through photosynthesis, they trap energy that comes from the sun. They convert that energy through a chemical reaction, and they store it in a organic compound called glucose. Well, there's this term in ecology called primary productivity, and that's the rate at which solar energy, sunlight, is converted into organic compounds, i.e. glucose, right? Via photosynthesis over unit time. I had to tell you all those things before they just say kids need to know this word. Well, there is so much going on, like what is solar energy? What is photosynthesis? Organic compounds. Glucose is an example, as carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And so now we can talk about what this means. So it's the rate at which the plants in an area are taking solar energy and transferring that into organic compounds, stored energy in the form of glucose per unit time. The best way to kind of think about productivity is through the units. So kilocalorie, first of all, K means kilo. That's a prefix, meaning 1,000 times. So if I have a kilogram, I have 1,000 grams. If I have a kilocalorie, I have 1,000 calories. Now be careful. Nutritional calories, like I'm going to go eat a burrito, are not the same thing as a lowercase chemistry calorie. A lowercase chemistry calorie, well, guess what? A kilocalorie is 1 nutritional calorie. So actually, kilocalorie means 1 nutritional calorie like we think of when we eat food. Fun fact. Just because, science has got to be complicated, right? So it's how much energy. So calorie or kilocalorie is a unit that measures energy. When we're eating food, it says this is a 600 calorie burrito. It's literally telling you how much chemical energy is stored inside that food that you're now going to consume. Pretty cool. So kilocalorie is a unit of measurement for the energy. And then it says per divided by meters squared. Well, meters is a unit that measures distance. I ran 500 meters, right? I'm running back. Well, if you take a distance and you multiply it by a distance, what is that formula for? So like length times width, you get area. If you take a distance squared, that is how you calculate the area of space that you have. If it was cubed, it'd be the volume, but that doesn't really make sense for plants because they're really just living on the surface, right? So we just need the area. So it's how much energy per area, because like we're saying, like this whole forest, this whole continent, you have to define the area for which we're calculating the energy. So energy per unit area, meters squared, per year time. So that's where the rate comes in. So I could say, it's 1,000 kilocalories per meter squared. Well, is that per day, per second, per year? Like, it's a rate. So kilocalories, is the amount of energy per meter squared per year. So if it says it's 500 kilocalories per meter per year, that means in 1 meter's area, in 1 year, we make 500 kilocalories of energy is going to be produced by the plants in that environment. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. You definitely need to recognize these units and understand what they mean. It's basically tell you how productive that area is in a given year. How much energy can be captured from the sun and stored in the form of glucose in 1 year in this area. Primary productivity is what's called. So what are some things that can affect primary productivity? Well, basically anything that can affect a plant's doing its thing. For starters, like sunlight, we need the energy part of the reaction. So, how much light an area gets, that's a huge one. The more light it gets, the more direct light it gets, the more of that reaction it's going to do. Well, how much oxygen is in the environment? That's going to affect, how much CO2, my bad, how much CO2 and how much water are in that area, because water and CO2 were the reactants. Energy, water, carbon dioxide, those three things a plant needs to store energy and make glucose. So how much water is available, how much light is available, and how much CO2 is available in its environment are all going to be able to affect primary productivity. We know that areas don't have equal amounts of primary productivity. Productivity is not even across our planet, and that's how they start doing calculations like how much food, like how much energy can we actually produce to sustain life. They look at the amount of arable land, meaning land that you can farm, and how productive it is. Certain countries look more like this. Certain countries more like that. And so actually energy isn't equally displaced across our planet. There are more resources and more energy available to living things in different parts of our planet. And therein lies a whole other set of issues if we're not thinking globally. Some countries can produce a lot more food than others. And how does that get distributed? How does that energy get distributed across the planet? And so primary productivity can be impacted by anything that's going to impact a plant's ability to do photosynthesis. How much light energy is available, how much water is available are the two main things. Basically the climate, the weather, that kind of thing. So lots of things. Okay. Here we go. Come on, iPad. There we go. Now, they kind of get into this term. So there's primary productivity. How productive our primary producers are. How much energy are they converting into glucose, basically? Well, there's this concept of gross primary productivity. It's the total rate of all the photosynthesis in a given area. And I just wanted to show this graph to you because I think it's really interesting. This is a gross primary productivity graph of the United States of America. And down here has to do with the calories. But long story short, red means, lots of productivity. And then over here, like the purples mean low productivity. And so we can see that the southeast region, which is humid, there's lots of rain, there's lots of sunlight, this latitude, very productive. This is also a farming area here. Now what's weird is kind of at a similar latitude, a little bit further north, you get all this like purple. Weird, why isn't that more productive? Well, there's this massive mountain range that comes down our country and causes a kind of effect that basically makes it so there's much less moisture and water available in this area. But then if you pop over here, it starts getting red, like over here again. You're thinking about the Pacific Northwest. All of a sudden, there's a lot of moisture there, a lot of rain. And so we're going to talk about this more. But even within our own country, resources in terms of energy, in the form of what primary producers can do for us, is not evenly distributed. And that has to do with climate. And so gross primary productivity is the total rate, the total amount of energy that was captured by plants and turned into basically glucose in their bodies. Now here's the deal. That's not necessarily like the most useful number. Because this is true. My gross means total. Just so you know, that word, it has many contexts. So the GDP for our country, the gross domestic product, the total amount of basically wealth our country accumulates. Gross income for me is $75,000 a year. But do I actually bring home $75,000 a year? So let's say you get a job, because you're going to get a job in a couple of years. They're going to say, you know what, that pays $150,000 a year. They're going to tell you the gross income. And you're like, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds real good. And if you go to buy a house, you'll say, oh, my income, it's this much. But the reality is that really how much money you bring home every year? And the answer is, well, of course not. I got to pay my dues. I got to pay my taxes. I got to survive. There's some cost to being alive, and kind of as humans, like taxes. I need roads. I need clean water. I need infrastructure. I need an education. I need health care, the things that taxes kind of pay for. That's another discussion. But, it's kind of like I have to spend some money just so I can survive, regardless. So I don't actually bring that much money home. Some of that's not going to be put in my pocket, right? And the same is true about plants. Plants, yeah, they're capturing energy from the sun and they're turning into glucose. And then they need to use some of that glucose. Like, they need to grow. They need to survive. They need to reproduce. And so some portion of the energy that they took from the sun and captured and put into chemical energy, they're then going to use. So how do I actually use the stored chemical energy to, do work as a living thing? And this is the chemical reaction for how do I take energy stored in glucose and do work. And this is crazy because it's the exact same reaction as the other one. It's flipped. It's the same one. You can go back a couple slides. This is called cellular respiration. So there's photosynthesis, which is taking energy and capturing it and putting it into glucose, right? And then I can take glucose and oxygen, and that's why we have to breathe in oxygen. Plants produce oxygen, and then we have to breathe the oxygen because they had it flipped. I'm like, here it is. This is why we have to breathe. It's only with oxygen can we use the glucose to do a chemical reaction that releases energy. Oh, by the way, we gotta pee. Where'd all that water come from? There it is. Oh, and we breathe out CO2. Those are the products of breaking down glucose and releasing energy to do work. Now, here's the thing. The energy came in as light energy, but when it goes out, it's going to be in a different form, a biologically relevant form, the form that we can actually use, which is called ATP, which I'll talk about in a minute. But plants need to use that energy too to live. I mean, this is called General Sherman, one of the largest trees on our planet, one of the largest organism on our planet, right? This is in Sequoia National Park, which is in your own neighborhood, 4-hour drive, biggest species of tree on our planet. It's absolutely fantastic, amazing. They're not doing so hot, but you can go see them. They're giants. They're called giant sequoias. It's amazing. It took a lot of energy to make a structure that big and to maintain that structure. They lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so some of that glucose that the plant makes, it has to use to, do work and survive. And so I have all the glucose I brought in, my gross primary product, but I had to use some of it, right, to survive. And so plants got to live and grow too. It's not just everybody else. So how do they unlock the stored energy they just made? It's almost like they took sunlight energy and they stored it into a battery. And then they got to turn the battery on. And that's called cellular respiration. If you took biology, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen this. You don't need to know the details of this. But basically what happens is you take the glucose chemical, you break it down through an organelle called the mitochondria, which is in all, it's in all animal cells and animals and plant cells. You don't need a mitochondria to break it down in bacteria. There's a little section out here that you can get ATP without. But most things have mitochondria that aren't bacteria. And so you'll see these little beep, 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 ATP. ATP is a molecule that carries energy in a biological form that's useful. Plants can't use sunlight either. They can just store it into glucose, and then take that glucose, break it down, and form ATP. And then ATP is actually the molecule they use for energy to do chemical reactions, to grow, to reproduce. This is our energy molecule too, and it starts with glucose and breaking it down. And so every living thing, whether it's a plant or an animal or a bacteria, is undergoing cellular respiration, has to break down glucose to make ATP. But the only organisms that can make glucose are plants. So that was a lot. There's a lot going on there. So just make sure you watch it again if you need to. So ATP is the language of living things when it comes to energy. This is a molecule. It's called adenosine triphosphate. This portion is the adenosine portion, and then we've got 3 phosphate groups, so triphosphate. This molecule carries energy. So that light energy that came from the sun gets stored into glucose through chemical. It's now chemical energy. And then we break down glucose and we form a bunch of these ATP molecules, which are just these molecules that are carrying tons of energy. And they're actually the ones that go throughout our body and help us do all the chemical reactions. ATP is what I'm using when I'm running really, really fast. So that is a lot. That is like an entire month's worth of stuff in biology. So again, you can always, the key here for ecosystems, plants capture energy in the form of light from the sun. They're able to take the light energy, transfer it into chemical energy, which is glucose, which is the store of the chemical energy. And then they can break down glucose to form ATP and do all the things they need to survive. When we eat plants, we get the glucose, and then we take that glucose and we break it down and form ATP so we can survive. So, what actually matters more than the growth is telling basically someone how much money you actually make after taxes. After taxes, how much money is in my paycheck. So before taxes, my paycheck's $6,000 or $7,000, I don't know, maybe it's $8,000. And then after taxes and insurance and my union fees and all that stuff, then it's actually $4,300 a month. This is actually probably too much information. My paycheck is $4,300 a month. That's how much I actually have to go deposit in the bank to buy food, pay my rent, pay my student loans, is $4,300. Even though my gross was $6,500, right? Or whatever it was. And so a better way to talk about how much total energy is available is to talk about net primary productivity. So a better way to describe the amount of energy captured by plants is through their net. So it's all the energy they produced minus the energy they actually used themselves so that they could survive and function. And so we're looking at this plant here, right? And the bunny's going to eat it. What's actually available to the bunny when it eats that plant is the net primary productivity. How much energy was actually left over in the plant that the bunny can then have and store inside of him. So the net primary productivity kind of makes more sense in terms of what's actually available to other organisms in their ecosystem in the form of kind of eating plants, if that makes sense. So, our first math equation. This is crazy. It's so difficult. Here it is. Net primary productivity equals gross primary productivity minus the energy used for respiration by the plant. So it's all the energy that it captured from the sun minus the energy it used to function through cellular respiration. Ta-da! And we'll practice this in class. Really straightforward. Really, really simple. Cool. So, just to kind of finish this up and bring it back to ecology a little bit more, let's just talk about some terms. There's so many vocabulary terms. So, plants are called producers. They're called autotrophs. But what is everybody else called? Well, then everyone has to eat the plants to get energy. So if you eat plants directly, you're consuming plants directly, we call you a primary consumer or an herbivore. So if you're a vegetarian, we call you an herbivore because you just eat plants. Primary consumers eat producers or primary producers. So this is an example of giraffe eating directly off of a tree. Then we've got, this is a Oh my gosh, it's escaping me what kind of whale this is. He has baleen. Maybe it's called baleen. These are called baleen this period here, and it actually sifts, and they grab phytoplankton from the water. So that's like the plant of the ocean, phytoplankton or plankton, and they eat plankton. So they're directly consuming the plants of the ocean. It's amazing. These are huge animals, a giraffe, a whale, and all they eat are plants. Gorillas only eat plants, and they're huge too. So, you can get away with just eating plants. Fun fact. We'll talk about that later. So, from here on out, those are some two terms you know. Also, fun fact, everyone who eats anything is a heterotroph. You're either a plant, you're an autotroph, you make your own energy, or you're a heterotroph. So if you have to derive your nutrients from eating other living things, you're a heterotroph. Plants don't eat other living things. They take inorganic nutrients, water and carbon dioxide, and a couple things that come out of the ground, like nitrogen compounds, and they take light energy, and that's it. They don't eat anything that's living. Everybody else is eating a living organism to get their energy from, because plants are living. So primary consumers. Now, if you eat primary consumers, you're a secondary consumer, and you're officially a carnivore. And so this is a little birdie eating a caterpillar, and the caterpillar ate the plant. So we've got the primary consumer being eaten by the secondary consumer. An example of that maybe in a marine environment. This is actually, I think, aquatic, but we've got a predatory carnivorous fish. There are carnivorous fish. The California sheep's head is a carnivorous fish, eats other, fishies and stuff, is eating another fish that eats algae to survive. So this would be a secondary consumer, and now we're in the realm of carnivores. And the final thing you can be is what we call a tertiary, and there is such a thing as a quaternary. It just keeps going up. Think quaternary. I'm trying to think of an example, but there definitely are some. If you're somebody who ate somebody who ate somebody, you're now a tertiary consumer, okay? And this is a frightening picture. This is what keeps my surfing brain awake at night. So this is a great white shark. It's an actual picture consuming a seal. Well, seals eat fish. And then maybe a fish ate plants. So you have the primary producer, which is the plant. And then you have the fish that ate the plant. That was the primary consumer. And then we have the secondary consumer, which was the seal, right, who ate the fish. And then we have the tertiary consumer, which is the shark that ate the seal. And so these are just some terms so that when you describe organisms in ecosystem, you can kind of talk about where do they lie on this schematic of energy, right? Energy had to transfer through a lot of organisms before it got to this shark or this raptor, which is eating a fox. Foxes are carnivorous themselves. This is an example of maybe a quaternary consumer, depending on what that fox ate and so on and so forth. So that's some general terms that are common in ecology. And they kind of get wrapped up in this concept of trophic levels. So what is a trophic level? It's basically just ecologists made this hierarchical system that comprises of living things, organisms. And at any given level, the organisms in that level share the same kind of nutritional relationship. So everybody in this level is a primary producer, whether it's the grass or the trees. And then on the next level up, we have the primary consumers of insects, a rat, caterpillar. They're all on the same trophic level, so they're organisms that kind of get their nutritional needs in the same way, which we call being a primary consumer. So trophic levels and trophic pyramids are a way of showing how energy transfers throughout an ecosystem. It's a helpful way for showing how organisms in an ecosystem are related to each other in terms of energy consumption. So this is another example of a trophic level. So we have our primary producers, primary consumer, secondary consumer is the snake, and the tertiary is the eagle. Now we're going to talk about this picture. Why are these boxes getting smaller? Well, you got to remember, any portion of energy taken in, whether it's the energy that got stored by the plant, well, the plant had to use some of that energy to survive. And then I ate the plant. Well, before the shark eats me, I have to use a lot of that energy to be surviving. And so the amount of energy that originally I got captured from the sun that's now available in me to the shark is a lot less, right? And we're going to talk about kind of the math behind that. And why do you lose energy? Because energy is conserved. Shouldn't I just have the same amount of energy all the way through? And I don't. It's not that the energy isn't conserved, it's that the chemical energy that's stored and available for living things is decreasing, and a lot of it's being transferred into a different type of energy called heat energy that isn't usable. Right now, there's heat coming off of me right now. So the chemical processes, which are being run by the chemical stored energy in my body, is being transferred into the version of heat. Now it's no longer usable to other living things. And so we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, but this is the idea of a trophic levels, showing us who's eating who, where is the energy coming from. And I don't want you to forget, the most important thing is, how do I even maintain this? A constant supply of energy from the sun. And the only plants that can the only body who can start the party are the plants, the plant party. They can take that light and they can transfer it into biologically relevant form of energy, glucose being that. So that was a lot. That was a lot bigger. I told you these lectures, they're going to get harder. There's going to be more terms. It's going to get crazier. So good luck with this tonight. It's a lot to take in. You guys are going to be great. You know a little bit more about the world around you than you did 30 minutes ago, and that's an awesome thing. So